Take a break, take a breath, and take a plunge into this powerful Ocean Ideas episode. We're joined today by acclaimed author James Bradley, sharing his insights from his award-winning book, Deep Water, The World in the Ocean, a moving, masterful story of how the ocean shapes life on Earth and reflects who we are. Brought to you by Ocean Lovers Festival, where stories, science, and solutions come together to protect what we love.
I'm the author of Deep Water, The World in the Ocean. I was going to just talk a little bit today about where the book came from and what it's about. I guess the book began for me quite a long time ago. I lived for a long time around here. I used to surf a lot. I used to swim a lot. I now live further away and do that less than I would like. But one of the things I really loved about that was not that, you know, you'd go surfing and there's that kind of rush of being on the wave, but that actually wasn't the thing I always really loved. The thing was that thing where you get out back behind the break and you can feel the swell moving underneath you. And there's that sense that you are suddenly in the presence of kind of the planet's rhythms. You can feel that sense of the kind of pulse of the wave, the movement of the cloud, and that sense that you're in something larger. And that idea of that you're suddenly in the presence of kind of the planet's rhythms, of a kind of scale of time, a scale of space that's very different to the one we're used to. It seemed to me to be a really powerful thing and something I wanted to think about. And now I wouldn't be the first person to kind of think that the ocean gives you that kind of sense of immensity. Freud talked about oceanic feeling. You know, Freud talked about this notion that the origin of religious feeling comes from that sense of immensity that you get with the ocean, this kind of oceanic feeling. You know, anyone who surfs, anyone who free dives, anyone who does any of those things knows that feeling that I'm talking about. Interestingly, there's some really fascinating science which suggests that the brain states you get into in those spaces are very similar to the ones that are induced by psychedelics. So again, you've got that kind of sense of profound connection, largeness going on. But what interested me about it was that it seemed to me that it gave you a way of thinking that might shift the way we understand a series of things. So we live in a kind of historical moment where we are in a sense, you know, there is a kind of set of interlocking crises all around us. You know, we're in the middle of a kind of environmental crisis, a climate crisis. You know, we've got authoritarian governments rising around the world. You know, there's a whole series of things going on at once, and they're all huge, and they all seem impossible to get a handle on, and they all seem impossible to do something about. And it seemed to me that maybe, just maybe, if you started to think with the ocean as a kind of lens, you might get at some of them differently. And, you know, that might seem like a kind of odd thing to say, but I mean, there is a sense in which the ocean gives us a series of ways of thinking about these things. If you want to talk about kind of the connectivity and the connectedness of the ocean, all life on the planet comes from the ocean. Every living thing on this planet comes from a moment of genesis that took place in the ocean. Maybe it took place in a pool, maybe it took place down in the deep, but it took place in the water. And there's a level at which that's a kind of banal thing to say, but there's actually something really profound in that, because if you think about it, what that means is that you are connected to every other living thing on the planet through the kind of genetic code that you carry, and connected back down through to that moment of genesis in the ocean billions of years ago. We are actually connected in a kind of really literal way to everything on the planet. The ocean gives you a whole series of models of connectivity. So, you know, animals move around in the ocean, fish migrate, whales migrate, you know, things move around. Insects actually migrate across the oceans. There's a series of insect migrations that take place from India to Africa and actually between continents across the ocean. So there's various kinds of butterflies and grasshoppers that actually fly across the ocean. Birds do the same thing. There's enormous migrations within the ocean. So there's a thing called the DL migration, which happens every day. It's the largest movement of life on the planet. It happens every night as it gets dark. Like billions of creatures move up from the mesopelagic, so down in the dark, up to the surface to feed. And that movement of life is so big. You know, as I say, it's the largest movement of life on the planet. It helps drive the carbon cycle, because those things absorb carbon at the top, carry it back down into the deep water. but it actually helps drive ocean circulation. There's some studies suggesting that it moves the water around more than the wind, in terms of kind of actually getting the water circulating within the ocean. So the ocean gives us these kind of models of connectivity to think about, but they also apply to kind of human stuff. So the ocean kind of contains our history in a really profound kind of way. The spread of human beings across the planet took place across the ocean. The movement of humans out of Africa about 1 million years ago. The movement of humans into Australia and the Pacific took place over the ocean. The movement of humans into the Americas took place over the ocean. So when humans went into America about 20,000 years ago, that didn't happen over the land because there was an ice sheet sitting there. What happened was they followed what they called the Kelp Road. And the Kelp Road was a kind of line of kind of bountiful kelp oceanic environments down the coast. So they went across and down, and that's how humans moved in to the Americas. And you see that kind of pattern being repeated all over the place, and particularly from about the 15th century on, when you see Europeans start expanding out of Europe. So colonialism is a shipborne phenomenon. It takes place on the oceans. Colonialism is where you see the beginnings of different models of kind of economics that depend upon plantations, upon extraction, upon these kind of highly destructive modes of economics. From the plantation, you get the factory. So you begin to see the origins of capitalism taking place on the ocean. You see the origin of the corporation on the ocean. You see the origin of the systems of insurance and things that we use on the ocean. You see the kind of empires that structured our world coming into place on the ocean. And you see also lots of the kind of habits of mind that flow from that. So the kinds of toxic racism that comes into our societies, that arises out of slavery. Slavery is a shipborne phenomenon. So the ocean becomes a kind of lens that you can kind of think about these questions with. And today, you look at our economy. The global economy is driven by the ocean. Shipping underpins the global economy. We do not have a globalised economy without shipping. 90% of everything you touch, everything you buy, you pick up, has been on a ship at some stage. We move 11 billion tonnes of goods around the world every year. And that underpins everything that we do. It drives our economy. The fossil fuel economy is driven by the ocean. 40% of that 11 billion tonnes is fossil fuels being shipped from place to place to make plastics, to burn, to drive our cars. That all happens because of the ocean. And it seemed to me that there was a way of kind of using the ocean to think about those things, because you start to see how they connect to each other in really profound ways. And it really matters because, not just because it gives us ways of thinking about it, because the ocean kind of contains our future, in a really powerful kind of way. And that's partly because so much of the heat that we've pumped into the atmosphere has gone into the ocean. About 90% of the extra heat we've pumped into the ocean over the last 50 years, into the atmosphere, into the planet, over the last 50 years has ended up in the oceans. It's an extraordinary amount of energy. There's a scientist called Dana Niticelli, and he talks about a hiroshima. Hiroshima is the amount of energy that was released by the bomb at Hiroshima. And in 2022, the ocean's absorbed 5 Hiroshimas worth of energy every second of every minute, of every hour, of every day that year. And all of that energy has gone into the ocean. And that's what's driving. You heard Matthew and the others talking before about the rise in temperatures, the shift in currents. The changes in the ocean is all being driven by that. And it's coming back, in a sense, towards us. So the ocean contains our future in that kind of way, but also in a different kind of way, because you can see in it kind of models of international cooperation. You can see in it ways of reorganising our economies. You can see all of these things in it, and you can also see different ways of thinking that are incredibly powerful. One of the things that you see with the oceans, I talked at the beginning about that sense of kind of immensity, and one of the things that you see with the ocean is that sense that when you think of the planet as a kind of blue planet, as a kind of interconnected whole, you begin to see how profoundly it all fits together, the way all of these things feed into each other and look after each other. The scientist James Lovelock talked about Gaia. He wanted to think about the Earth as a kind of interconnected, actually living whole. The astronauts who went into space, they look down and they look at the planet and they have this thing they call the overview effect, which they talk about, where astronauts go up and they look at the planet and they suddenly go, it's all one thing, it's all one living thing. Now, I have to say, I don't think you had to send people into space to do that. I reckon if you asked any Indigenous person on the planet, they'd tell you that for free. But, that kind of recognition of the interconnectedness of life, of the way it's all one thing that kind of lives and is connected, is incredibly powerful. And I'm going to finish, but one of the things I talk about in the book is this lovely moment from a Roman geographer called Pomponius Mela. And Mela talked about the tides, and he said what the tides are the breath of the world breathing. And he had this idea that the world was alive and that when it breathed, the tides went in and out. But it seems to me that you take that idea of connectedness and you can kind of reframe the way we think about things. You can see why it matters, that we have to find kind of new ethical solutions to a lot of these things, but also, directions to some ways of thinking about these things, which are not about doubling down on things that we've already done, but about finding better ways of doing them. So, I don't know, have I got time for questions?
I'm curious because you speak about the connection that we all have to the ocean, but there's also this mentality of out of sight, out of mind, and all the things that are happening that we don't care about because we can't see them. And how do you think we can change that so people see the ocean in the same way that you do and the way that you have speak about it?
Yeah. So one of the things I really wanted to do in the book was to think about that sense that in the ocean, so much of what happens there is kind of invisible to us. And that's both in the sense that there's all of these kind of environmental things going on. So we dump stuff in the ocean. We treat it as a kind of blank space that we can kind of throw things into. But it's also in a kind of economic sense. Like I talked about shipping. We don't think about shipping. We don't think about what fishing is doing to the ocean. It all kind of happens out there. And you see it happening again, I think, at the moment with deep sea mining. It's kind of sense that because it's down there, it's out of sight, it's unconnected to us. But if we can start to think about the ocean again as, all of these things as kind of connected and think about that connectivity, what becomes really clear is that the deep ocean is profoundly connected to us. It's part of the carbon cycle, as Matthew was saying before, a lot of the currents that kind of manage the world's weather systems, rely on the movement of water through deep water. I think that trying to get people around to recognising that interconnectedness is really, really important, because you do then start to see some of those invisible things becoming visible. Not treating the deep ocean as something that's unconnected to us and weird and strange, but something that is profoundly connected to us. The other thing about the deep ocean to remember is that depending on which way you count it, the deep ocean is about 90% of the inhabitable biosphere on the planet. Like, we're not a terrestrial planet. We're not even just an ocean planet. We're a deep ocean planet. I think they're important ways of thinking about it, because they get you to think about some of those invisible things. But you're absolutely right. A lot of it's invisible, and people treat it like it's invisible because it's out there. Out of time.
We will need to wind things up there, but would you join me in thanking James Bradley?
Thank you, everybody.
If you enjoyed today's Ocean Ideas episode or felt moved by James's powerful perspective, please share it with someone who loves the ocean too. That's how we continue to grow this blue-hearted community and keep the conversation flowing. Brought to you by the Ocean Lovers Festival, celebrating ideas, innovation, and action for the ocean we all love.